Welcome to Velina's podcast. Today's episode is dedicated to the situation on the global oil and gas markets. And at the end of the conversation, we are also going to cover COP28. My guest today is Dr. Anas Alhajji. He's a renowned expert on global oil and gas sector. He's a keynote speaker. He has daily and weekly reporting on Substack. He has also another platform where he's contributing on Energy Attica, where I also have the pleasure to provide a weekly analysis. And this podcast episode is possible due to the support of Bharat Vata. This is one of India's leading podcast producers on politics, policy, and society. Dr. Alhajji, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you with us today because we have plenty of interesting topics to cover. And I would like to hear first and foremost your assessment about what has happened just recently with the volatility in the oil market, specifically when it comes to the oil price. And now what is also based on that, your anticipation for the final quarter, what is going to happen with the oil price?
Yes, we worked on our 2023 oil market outlook in December and early January, and we published a summary of the outlook on January 3rd this year. And in that outlook, we labeled this year as the year of two halves. It's a story of two tales, the first half and the second half. And the second half is completely different from the first half. So the second half basically is bullish, and the fourth quarter in particular is more bullish. So we already written this long ago, and whatever you see today was literally predicted. The only difference between December, January, and now is the issue of will we have 100 and above 100 oil or not. Early in January, we had the possibility of reaching 100. Then later on, as we went through the year, we found out that the Chinese were building their strategic and commercial inventories, and they built a significant amount that was not in the forecast. And we knew from studying the behavior of the Chinese companies and the Chinese governments over the years that they will use this oil that they stored when oil prices go up. And they've been using that. They already released about 50 million barrels from their inventories, and we expect them to release another 35 to 40 million barrels from now until the end of the year. So our view in the middle of the year was we are not going to have $100 oil simply because the Chinese are going to flood the market with their inventories. The $100 oil is still up in the air. Our view is still there are no fundamental basis for the $100 oil at this stage. Will it happen? I mean, we could be wrong. We would be wrong before, and it could happen. But the idea here is, based on market fundamentals, there is no justification for higher prices than what we see today. In addition, we have other issues we have to really pay attention to. One of them is that we have the winter coming and the expectation that this winter is going to be warm. And that's going to literally change many outlooks out there if the winter is warm. Not only because what we learned over the last 40, 50 years about warm winters and the impact on the oil market, simply we have several issues that did not exist before. We have the invasion of Ukraine that resulted in sanctions that led to changes in global trade in energy, not only in oil, in energy in general. We have those major changes, and those changes basically are literally a game of musical chairs. And when you play a game of musical chairs, it's very difficult to know who is going to get what, simply because even after the invasion, and it's been a while now, it's almost going to be 2 years very soon, the situation of international trade is not settled yet. The patterns are not set yet. We see them changing all the time. So with warm winter, we have a serious problem. The other issue is, since 2022, we've seen substitution among energy sources in a way that we never seen before. And that's another variable. which means that the impact is not only on oil and gas, the impact is on all energy sources. And people, that's the third factor, people must understand, and this is one of the fundamentals of energy economics right now. When countries are in recession, the share of renewable energy, increases during recessions. Why? Because the sun is going to shine whether you have a recession or not. The wind is going to blow whether you have a recession or not. But you can control fossil fuel. You can control the use of coal. You can control the use of gas. You can control the use of oil in this case. And therefore, in recessions, the demand for oil, gas, and coal declines. But we may not see a decline in renewable energy, and therefore their share in the whole energy pie increases. And the problem we are seeing now is people are taking this now and extrapolating, and they start talking about peak oil demand and peak coal demand, etc. You cannot say this when you have recessions. We have recession in several European countries. We have slowdown in the Chinese economy. So we cannot really extrapolate from this data. And therefore, the situation between warm winter and the war in Ukraine and the economic situation, the view is really foggy right now. And it's very difficult to make definite predictions, especially about 2024, simply because of those factors. But the elements that are influencing oil prices right now on the demand side are mostly bearish. And the reason why we have $95 oil today are the Saudi and the Russian cuts, because they are large.
Mm-hmm. So let's unpack a little bit maybe this side of the equation that actually refers to Europe. And you've already mentioned it's a second winter Europe is facing. Actually, the prognosis of a warm winter is good news, given the fact that Europe almost, let's say in general, successfully coped with the first winter, also thanks to the fact that it was a relatively warm one. But at the same time, we are now observing that the oil cap price is actually no longer functioning the way it was meant to be. Could you give us some analysis on the way how the geopolitical tensions and the sanctions are in fact influencing the oil and specifically the oil, but also the gas markets when it comes to Europe as a, let's say, energy deprived continent, specifically given the precarious situation?
Yes, when people in Europe and the United States talk about sanctions and the impact of sanctions on Russia and how it affected the oil and gas markets, it's always a one-sided story. But the facts are there. Since the imposition of sanctions in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Russia started looking for alternatives. So when you look at the impact of the sanctions, it's really two parts. One part, Russia willing to divert its gas specifically to other countries like China and to LNG. At the same time, some European countries do not want to import from Russia. So it's not one-sided story. It's a two-sided story that Russia wanted to diversify too. And we have evidence since 2014. The European actions are only from 2022. So those pipelines, these multi-billion-dollar pipelines, they've been planned since 2014, way before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when we talk about sanctions, it's really two parts. So there's the Russian reaction and there is the European reaction. On the other side, sanctions never worked. What does that mean is we have a country that, let's say it's a rogue country that did something bad, and other countries wants to change its behavior and bring it back to where it was. And we call that the targeted country. And the objective is to force the country to change its behavior, or to force the leadership of that country to change its behavior. We have never seen this happening. If you look at all sanctions, and there are too many in the last 120 years, we did not see a single sanction working. Sanctions never worked. Never worked in a sense that they never forced the targeted country to change its behavior. As a result, we end up in a situation where politicians in democratic societies want to show the population they are doing something. So they know that sanctions do not work, but they do it for its symbolic value. So they have to do it no matter what. That's from political point of view. On the other side, once you impose sanctions on another country, you invoke nationalism in that country, and people will rally around the leadership or rally around the flag. And therefore, you have two hardened positions. A politician in a democratic society who wants to keep his position and show symbolically that he's doing something, while the other country basically is feeling that they need to rally around the flag and therefore they have to oppose the other country. But they don't work. They cause pain, yes, a lot of pain. But the pain is to both groups, not only to one party. So it's not only the Russians that are hurting from the sanctions. We know Europe and the United States suffer too because of that. They suffer from high prices, they suffer from shortages, they have to switch, they have to do a lot of things. So the pain is on both sides in this case. With sanctions, we always find a way to sell that oil to someone or to sell that gas. We will find a way. And the Russians found various ways to do that. At discounted prices, yes. But they were able to sell it. Are they still in government? For God's sake, the Cuban government is still there after 60 years of sanctions. They're still there. So sanctions really do not work in forcing the targeted country to change its behavior, but they cause a lot of pain. In the oil market, we are still learning how sanctions basically work. And the reason why we are saying this, we went through several sanctions in the past. We learned a lot of lessons. But this is the only time when a major producing country with 11 million barrels of production and 7 to 8 million barrels of exports being sanctioned. So the impact on the globe is larger than ever. And the musical chairs and the game of musical chairs basically is larger than ever. That leads us to another point, which I've been highlighting for a while now, that even before the Russian invasion of Kuwait, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we always used to talk about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So now, kind of something to be reminded with. So what we ended up with a situation was where the data quality in the energy market, especially in the oil market, was already bad, and it's been deteriorating, especially since 2017. And now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then the sanctions, the data deteriorated significantly with the largest dark fleet ever on water right now. So the problem we have right now is this. If someone comes in and say, well, Iran exported 1.1 million barrels a day, and someone else comes in and say, Iran exported 700,000 barrels a day for the same period, and someone else will come in and say Iran exported 1.4 million barrels a day. Guess what? You cannot even criticize a single one of them because no one knows. No one knows. And that's why some researchers basically resorted to the idea, okay, I'm going to take the average of everyone and that's it. And that's what OPEC does anyway. But the idea here is when you have large dark fleet, you don't know, and therefore you end up with so many numbers. And the reason why, because tracking companies, they have several methods to track, and because of different methods and because of changes in weather all the time, you get different numbers. So the only way to be consistent basically is, if you want to follow that, is to follow, let's say, a company or two, but you have to be consistent. You cannot jump between companies. The moment you jump between companies, your data set is useless. So we do have a serious problems right now in the oil market in terms of data. In the gas market, when it was local, when it was regional, we have more control of the data and we have more knowledge. Now, through LNG, the gas market is becoming global. We are going to suffer the same issue with the data quality, where the deterioration in the data quality is going to be transferred to the natural gas market.
I am giving currently this interesting example with Germany just to maybe let's say, give an example for our audience with the Indian exports of what you've just described. The Indian exports of fuel to Germany, which of course we know for a fact from where it comes, increased by 1,127% in the first half of the year compared to the same period in the previous year. So you understand that this kind of commodities cannot be controlled if there is.
Let's go over this here, if you don't mind. We've written several reports on this with the charts and data to show how this is working. When the G7 and the EU agreed to impose the sanctions and they signed that document, it is written in that document that if the Russian oil is modified enough, countries can import it. So they knew this from day one, that they are going to ban the crude and they are going to import the products because it's written in the document. So it is what India is doing, what China is doing, what other OPEC plus members are doing is literally legal by any standard, because they modified the oil enough for the EU members to import it. So they knew that. So India and others basically just played the game. So Europe is literally importing Russian oil. The US is importing Russian oil because they imported that through India. What is not legal in this case is the following: transshipments, which means a country like Turkey importing Russian diesel and then re-exporting that diesel to Europe because it did not go through the modification in Turkey. So that's illegal. However, the Europeans are turning the blind eye to that because they need the diesel.
Especially now.
But those who are interested in this, all the numbers and all the charts basically are in our reports country by country, and is showing, we called it oil laundering, just like money laundering. And oil laundering, basically part of it is really legal, so it's not laundering because of that exception that Europe gave to the modification. But many countries are doing oil laundering in many ways, especially for the Iranian oil. And when we talk about data deterioration, one of the problems we faced all the time was how much oil China is importing from Iran. Because whatever number is there, in reality, it's way larger. And the reason why, because Iranian oil is going to other countries, relabeled, and then shipped to China through those countries. And the number one country that is famous for that is Malaysia. Malaysia, in fact, for certain months of the year, exports more than its production. So where that oil is coming from, where that crude is coming from. So that's another data deterioration we have, that even international trade data, which is supposed to be more accurate than others because of the costumes and everything else, still there are too many games to be played, and the data is not that good. We've seen that with Iran over the years. We've seen it before Iran. By the way, if this is for the audience, how did the Iranian play the market during sanctions? How they learned it? They learned it from Saddam Hussein. Their enemy, basically, they helped their enemy. They learned from him how to smuggle the oil, because he was smuggling about 400 to 500,000 barrels a day through various venues. And that's how the Iranians started their game.
And given all this background, what is your anticipation for the gas price amid the winter season? Do you anticipate another surge in the gas price as we've seen last year, specifically when it comes to Europe? Some still argue that actually the energy crisis is looming, that despite all the financial support, more than 700 billion has been spent, 700 billion euro has been spent to mitigate the risks from the energy crisis last year. It was just for 1 year. What is your anticipation? Are we going to see surging gas prices again this year, given also the fact that Europe still lacks some amount of gas on the global markets?
We publish an EU gas tracker every month with all details about where the gas is coming from, and et cetera, for every country, for the whole group. And in that gas, in the recent one, basically, it was very clear that imports from Russia are increasing. And Gazprom basically is exporting more gas to Europe. And we believe that this share is going to increase. The fact is, if they are going to import more from Russia, they are not going to experience shortages even if the winter is cold or severe. But if they don't want to import from Russia, or Russia basically kind of put limits on exports to Europe, then they will end up with problems if the winter is severe. The problem we've been talking about in the last 2 months was the strike by the LNG workers in Australia. Australia does not export any LNG to Europe. All the exports, naturally, because of the geography, goes to Asia. And the idea was, if we end up with a strike that's going to halt exports, then Asian countries are going to be scrambling throughout the world to literally take the LNG from the Europeans. And they can afford it. They can pay the higher price, as we've seen before. And therefore, the shortages, although Australia does not export to Europe, the shortages are going to be in Europe, not in Asia. And therefore, LNG prices might hit a record again under that scenario. But now we know that the strike was called off, so that ended that issue. Now it's really a weather situation. And when we talk about weather, there are two issues here we have to pay attention to. And again, back to what we learned in 2022, when we talk about the substitution among energy sources in a way that we never seen before. If we end up, we have the cold winter, which means that demand for energy increases. But if we end up with severe or large amount of rain in certain areas in India and China, where coal mines are flooded, that's going to affect the coal supplies. And what the alternative? The only alternative in this case is LNG. So just flooding the coal, so that shows you the substitution in a way that we never seen before, that you have flooding in certain areas, no more coal, and the only substitute is LNG. So LNG prices go through the roof. Now LNG is very expensive. Countries do not have coal. They cannot afford to pay that much for LNG. They end up with power shortages. When they end up with power shortages, we see a different phenomenon. Now companies, factories, and people resort to private generation. And private generation needs diesel or LPG. That's oil. And the problem with that is, if you look at those countries' use of oil in power generation, it's very tiny, it's very small. Even in India and China, it's less than 1%. But when you end up with massive use of power generation, demand goes up for oil. Now they have enough power basically to do whatever they want to do. But that power generation and the use of oil is not counted anywhere. So even at the end of the year, even if they use 100,000 barrels of oil in a month, that 100,000 barrels a day is not going to show up in power generation anyway, because it is private generation. Again, we're back to the idea of data deterioration. That's one of the problems in accounting. But you see how we started with coal, and we ended up with LPG and diesel. These things did not happen before. So this is one of the things. Now you add renewable energy to it, the situation becomes more complex. Wind stops. I mean, like we've seen it in Texas this summer. What happened is that temperatures were very high throughout the summer. Why they are high? Because wind is not blowing. When wind blows, temperatures decline. If wind is not blowing, then wind power generation is going to decline substantially. What is the substitute? Now you have to resort to some flexible substitute. Coal is not that flexible. Nuclear is not that flexible. What is flexible? Natural gas. You end up with natural gas, so you work those plants, and if one of the plants trip because of the heat or because of some other issues, then you have a crisis and you have power shortages. And what the media will do, they will blame natural gas for that.
Well, it's interesting because if you take a look at also what actually the European Union countries have purchased since beginning of the invasion, you will see still plenty of, as you said, also LNG and obviously natural gas, oil, LPG, all of the plethora. In fact, more than 165 billion so far since the invasion, out of the 430 billion in revenue from the Russian fossil fuels are actually due to European purchases. Speaking of sanctions and speaking of what Europe has been doing, as you said, on, let's say, behalf of the political decision makers. What is actually, I see that some of our viewers and audience are also asking questions, and they want to hear your assessment about the target price of oil for the first quarter next year. Do you have already an anticipation? Are we going to still see a similar scenario as in this quarter, or are we going to see, I mean, you've already outlined some of the key factors, but where do you see the oil price?
I am going to repeat a statement. It's a tweet, basically, I said a while ago, and I'm going to repeat it as is because it does apply today. That OPEC or OPEC Plus or the Saudis, whatever group you think is influential here, they will defend $90 Brent until it's no longer defensible. So as long as there is support to keep prices above 90, they will maintain that. They will do whatever to keep prices at that. And here I would like to explain to some viewers one issue they have to pay attention to. Economics is one thing. The economics of natural resources is another. And oil is a natural resource. So economic rules and supply and demand, as you know it, do not apply to the oil market. There are completely different analyses there. And I'm saying this for a reason, because they said, well, Saudis lost market share. Well, the whole idea of market share here is absolutely incorrect, because if they cut production by 1 million barrels a day, they just conserved their resource by 1 million to be sold for in the future, probably for a higher price. They just cut CO2 emissions, and coincidentally, you want to talk about COP28, just before COP28. And they are going to go, we'll talk about COP28 in a minute, but the idea here is the benefits to the Saudis from the cuts are tremendous. It's not only for prices going up from 75 to 95, so you have $20 a barrel, but they conserve the resource. Now they have better pressure in some of the fields. Now they can manage the reservoir better, and at the same time they can sell this in the future while they reduce their CO2 footprint just before the COP28, which is in their backyard in Dubai. So the benefit. So those who are talking about, oh, the Saudi policy is kind of a bad policy and they are losing market share, etc. The second thing they have to understand is, again, it's a musical chair. Yes, India imported more from Russia at the expense of other countries, but other countries now are selling in Europe where Russia was selling. So it's a game of musical chairs. And because of this, the Saudis were able to increase their prices, their OSP prices or official selling prices, $4 or $5 above Brent or Dubai or WTI, simply because of the situation. So those who are talking about loss of market share, they really need to study the oil market really hard to realize the true nature of natural resource economics. So again, the objective is not to let Brent go below 90, but if market forces basically force them to do it, then it will drop. We've seen this before so many times. But the idea here is 90 is the target in this case. Number two, on the demand side, as I mentioned, there are weakness. It's not as strong as before. And we have some serious problems to think about. Even in the US, gasoline demand is not back where it was in pre-COVID in 2019. So we do have some problems. When it comes to China in particular, we have to distinguish between demand and consumption, because that's where some banks and some analysts got fooled in the middle of the year when they said oil prices will go, or in the first half when they said oil prices will go above 100, and some people talk about 120, 125, simply because misunderstood what China was doing. China's increase in imports, they thought, was expressing a strong demand because of recovering economy. What they did not understand was they were importing a lot of oil, a lot of cheap oil, to store it in addition to the consumption. So the imports were not a reflection of a strong growth. They were a reflection of weak economy on one side and the desire to build inventories. And that's how they were able to build inventories to 1.1 billion barrels, about 300 million above the total of the US. That include the strategic and commercial inventories. The other side of the equation is when it comes to shale. Our view is that shale will continue to grow and it's going to hit new record. And it's been this our view since 2020 when everything collapsed. And then we emphasized this last year. That was against the grain because a lot of people thought it just peaked or is going to peak. And now we are breaking record after record. And the expectations, even from the EIA, that production will decrease in October. We got to wait and see what will happen in October and whether this decline is kind of a temporary decline or it's a final decline, because many people think that's it. It's maxed out, it will decline. And when we talk about shale this way, we got to think about the ramifications of it. People are throwing those words without realizing the impact of this. If shale starts declining, the impact on the world is way beyond any one of us thinking. And it needs really kind of a large number of analysts to be able to handle studying the impact of that. Why? Because the impact in the last 10 years was no one even could have dreamt of the impact of the shale revolution. The impact is not only on oil and gas. The impact is on NGLs. The impact on the petrochemical industry worldwide. The political impact was massive. In fact, there was no way on earth that President Trump in 2018 would reimpose sanctions on Iran and impose sanctions on Venezuela at the same time without the shale revolution. There was no way on earth that Europe will be united today without the shale revolution because of the LNG. There was no way on earth today that the Biden administration would keep Europe together without the shale revolution. The impact is huge. So if the shale revolution ends, just reverse all of that, and you can see the impact worldwide. And yesterday we published a report focusing on Nigeria. And part of that report, basically, we said the following. If shale peaks and started declining, the country that will benefit the most is Nigeria, simply because it is the country that hurt the most by the shale revolution. Just imagine this. Because of the shale revolution, U.S. imports from Nigeria declined by 93%. 93%. Now Nigeria has to go and look for a market. That I'm talking about 2012, 13, and 14. And if Nigeria is going to go and search for the market, they are literally competing with other OPEC members. So one of the first, largest impact of the shale revolution on OPEC, it did split OPEC into two halves. Those who lost market share in the United States and those who did not lose market share in the United States. That's a dream for any US politician to be able to split OPEC that way. What the result? The result was the collapse in the oil market in 2015. So the impact is huge. Now imagine reversing all of this. The US was able to maintain the sanctions on Iran because of the shale revolution. If the shale production and condensates in particular are going to decline substantially, the whole world needs the Iranian condensates. And then European countries will start cheating on the sanctions simply because they cannot survive without the condensates. The same thing for India and China.
Yes, you have presented quite an extensive overview, and at the end of our conversation, I would like to hear your opinion on the upcoming COP28 in UAE. Now we know that UAE has also turned into a critical hub, specifically now in the last 19 months, of a raging war here in Europe because of the sanctions, where on the other hand, obviously, Russia used the UAE, in fact, to let's say, reroute its own commodities. But UAE is also a critical player in the fossil fuel sector. How is actually the ambition of UAE now turning also into the, let's say, sector of the green transition? Do you have a specific expectation for the outcome of COP28?
I have two issues. One of them is being very critical, and I will mention it now. You are talking about COP28 in Dubai. It's an Arab city. UAE is United Arab Emirates, in the middle of the Arab Peninsula, in the heart of the Arab world. And yet, Arabic ignored the Arabic language completely and ignored the Arab press completely. And that's a shame.
Do you have an
Now,
explanation for that?
COP28
Is
might
it a PR thing? Do you have an explanation?
the only explanation I have, basically, it's a European managed, and the Europeans basically focus on themselves, and that's it. But I think the leadership of the UAE should realize that ignoring the Arab world and the Arabic language was a big mistake. But this COP28 might end up one of the most important meetings in the history of those 28 meetings and the ones that preceded them. And the reason why, because as we highlighted in our reports, the narrative is changing. The European narrative of climate change has failed, and failed miserably. Earlier, you mentioned the $700 billion in subsidies to fuel and other things. That's one of the failures. So the whole world is watching, and they watched the suffering of the Europeans last year. They watched how they reneged on their promises and what they stand for. And they reneged in a New York minute. It's not like it took them time it was just a New York minute when they reneged on all of that stuff. When the European governments basically reneged, and they kind of decided to have a U-turn on climate change, the European oil majors followed, and they reneged on all their promises, etc. The European leaders, the politicians, can still talk about climate change because they are politicians. But the oil companies have to literally tell the investors, look, I need to go back to oil and gas. And the evidence are there. Every time a company returned to oil and gas, its stock went up. I mean, it was very, very clear. Everyone saw that. So the oil producing countries are not happy with the European narrative, and especially with the propaganda of the International Energy Agency and the head of the UN, and the extremism of the IEA and the head of the UN. You have Africa, the whole continent. If you listen to African leaders, all of them are telling the Europeans, look, my CO2 emissions are not even 1 day of your emission. My emissions for a year is not even 1 day of your emissions. And you are trying to halt my economic development for you. India does not like it. China does not like it. So you have the oil producing countries, you have Europe, you have people around the world realizing that those policies are extreme. Now, I want readers to understand this, and this is a very important comment I'm going to make here. We are not talking about climate change here. We are not critical of the ideas of climate change. We are not climate change deniers. And none of OPEC members and their leadership are climate change deniers. Even the Indians and the Chinese are not climate change deniers. What they are critical of are the policies used to fight climate change. There is a big difference here. Even it's a legal argument in this case. So we are critical of the policies of climate change, not climate change itself. The fact is, if you look at future energy demand going up substantially in recent decades, and is going to continue going up this way for a very long time. And here is the fact. If you look at emerging economies where energy demand is increasing, it means that as they invest in renewable energy, they are barely meeting the increase in demand. And therefore, the renewable energy is not substituting coal, oil, and gas in this case, simply because of that large increase in energy all the time. So the idea that we can replace oil, for example, is nonsense for many reasons. And one of them is, if you look at OECD countries, you look at India, you look at China, that's almost 80% of global oil demand. Their use of oil in power generation is less than 1% for most countries. So even if they double renewable energy, the impact of oil is extremely limited. So that's one side. Now you want to go for electric vehicles. All right. We are not against electric vehicles. So demand for energy is going up. The only way to meet that demand is we do need solar. We need wind. We need geothermal. We need oil. We need gas. We need coal. We need nuclear. So we need all of them. That's number one. Number two, we need all kind of technologies to enhance energy efficiency, whether in the production or in the use. Third, we need all kind of transportation technology, whether electric, hydrogen, or anything else that will come up in the future. We need that. We are not against it. We are against the hype. We are against the craziness that we see, especially from the head of the UN, who accuses every investor in fossil fuel of being crazy. That's crazy. The fact is, and this is where, when we talk about the hype and the lies in particular, there is a story I repeat all the time. And this is a very important story for the readers to realize what it means. One of the biggest research organizations that produce reports about renewable energy and electric vehicles produced a report. And in that report, they say this mega city is going to shift all its buses to electric buses. And that's going to reduce all demand by 60,000 barrels a day. I contacted the head of transportation in that organization. And I told him, look, you guys said this. And he said, yes. And he started bragging about the sophistication of their model. I said, please, I'm not going to talk about any sophistication of your model. I'm not going to talk about the math. I'm not going to talk about anything else. I'm going to talk about facts in the ground. That city does not have a single bus that runs on diesel. Not a single bus. They've been running on CNG for years. You would think they would thank me for this and correct what they have in the report. We're talking about 60,000 barrels decline in oil demand. The impact is really on CNG, is on gas, not on oil. But what happened? They published the report, they went to their annual conference, and they insisted that demand will decline by 60,000 barrels a day. That was a big lie. If you want to know why prices went up and demand recovered strongly, simply above what they expect, because they lied. A whole province in China and a whole city. In 2008, I did that report, and in 2008, we were studying the impact of switching of this province and this city, switching their cars, especially taxis and public transportation, to CNG. It is the same province and the same city that switched to electric, and yet they counted that as decline in oil demand by over 300,000 barrels a day. It has zero impact on oil. So we are against the hype. We are against the lies in this case. The final point I would like to mention here is the oil industry, yes, it produces emissions. The oil industry has a bad side to it, and we admit that, and people admit that, been admitting that for a very long time. The oil men are not saints. We know that. But if you want to talk about the impact of the oil industry on climate change, if you want to talk about the externalities, as you learned from your Econ 101, the externalities are good and bad. Why, when it comes only to oil and gas, you focus on the bad and you forget the good that is introduced by it? We need to focus on the net. And the fact is, and I think a lot of people agree with this, and it can be easily proven, that you and I are probably alive today because of oil and gas. The population growth that the world experienced in the last 100 years would not have been possible without the ability to feed those people. And how we were able to feed those people? It was the industrial fertilizers that came from natural gas. Otherwise, this generation probably would not, most of it would not have existed today. So let's focus on the benefits too. We are admitting that there are disadvantages and there are problems and there are bad things, but let's focus on the net in this case and go back to COP28. So this is part of the change in the narrative, that don't forget how much good I contributed. And as the previous head of Aramco said in a meeting, in an open forum at a university in Brazil, when he said, our job is to bring happiness to the world. And people were surprised. What do you mean? He said, when you wake up, and he went through the day, the activities of the day, and literally the oil bring happiness to people. Without it, many things that we are doing today we would not be able to do. So the narrative is changing by highlighting the benefits of those industries. On the other side, the problem is not with oil and gas. The problem is with CO2, with the emissions. So the industry came up with solutions. We don't know how viable those solutions is. So we admit that whether you are talking about carbon sequestration or other things, etc. But what we are finding out, and that's the hard way, and we are going to see this at COP28, that the oil, by the way, this is the first time the oil industry is present at COP28. And this is one of the jokes about those environmental meetings, that if your concern is about CO2 and the energy industry is the biggest emitter of CO2, why they are not at the table? Why you are banning them? You know, in Glasgow, they were banned. That tells you that they have their own narrative. They don't want to hear the other side. So that's why the Dubai meeting, COP28, might end up a historic meeting because the industry is present. And they are going to literally take a lead on climate change policies by changing the narrative, the European narrative in this case. Now, what the problem is, since the problem is CO2, it's not oil and gas, the industry said, okay, I'm going to get rid of CO2. Here are my ways of getting rid of CO2. Do you know what the other side says? They said, no, that's not acceptable. And that's not going to work. So why your experimental technologies work and my experimental technology, all of them do not work? Okay, give me a chance to prove to you that we can reduce our CO2 emissions, we can reduce our footprint, but you are not even allowing me to do that. And you are always excluding me. And so that's the discussion we are going to see, that the change in the narrative we are going to see. I think the other side will be forced, literally, to accept the proposals regarding carbon sequestration and other things, etc. One of the biggest ironies of COP27 and 28, and before it, COP26, that are all held in places where oil and gas is produced.
Well, I think that this is on purpose, meant to send a message, right?
I don't know whether that's the case or not, because if my theory is correct, I think we are going to see more meetings in places where demonstrations will be limited or non-existent.
But indeed, ahead of the COP28, the political agenda is already shifting. Now we hear, for instance, here in Europe, already key political stakeholders admitting that even until 2030, we would see still, I quote, molecules of fossil fuels in the energy mix of Europe. So they are already admitting to this reality. We are also seeing European Union member states that are now including, relaunching certain components of the energy mix, for instance, nuclear energy, as it is the case with Sweden, which is, by the way, a frontrunner in terms of share of renewables in its energy mix. So in order to provide for the stability of its, let's say, electricity grid system, it needs also additional components of the energy mix because of the lack of such stability if they rely only on renewables. So we see already a shift in the political narrative as well because of reality. So in a sense, I suppose that what we are going to observe is more on behalf of, as you said, CO2 and also financial mechanisms. So in order to kind of sell the whole thing as a success, maybe there will be more messaging in terms of financial pledges, financial mechanisms, legislation, regulation, and so on.
We have two facts about the energy transition and the green economy. Energy transition and the green economy is inflationary by nature, and politicians do not like inflation. So you can see the first contradiction here. The second fact is most of the technologies that are needed for the energy transition does not exist. And if some of them exist, we lack standardization because they are not standard. The cost is different. And if there are problems in one country, we cannot switch the equipment between those two countries simply because they are different. So we do have serious problems. And now we are discovering additional problems, and these problems basically are going to slow down that energy transition. To give you an example, we have a major insurance company in the UK literally stopped insuring electric vehicles. That was 2 days ago. They literally they stopped, and all those clients whose policy is expiring, they are not renewing. And their view basically is the cost is so high, we got to wait, we got to study it, and then come up with the new premiums, and we will talk to you. That's one major issue. If you look at the United States, insurance premiums for electric vehicles are going through the roof. And now the highest insurance premiums in the United States are all for electric vehicles. So yes, you save on maintenance only to pay it in premiums of insurance. Why? Because of cost of repairs from accidents is super high. It's been estimated that the cost of repairs of electric vehicle is 24% higher than the similar ICE car, and it stays in the shop 14% more. And one of the ironies is that this company in England mentioned that one of the reasons why they raised rates, that's another company from the one that halted the insuring electric vehicles. They said one of the reasons why they raised it because the car rental rates went up substantially. And, they have to provide the car rental based on the agreement, or depending on what the agreement is, they have to provide a car rental for additional time if you own electric vehicle. Here in the United States, just a few years ago, let's say 2018, 2019, we can get a decent car for $20 a day. Now the same car is for 75 and 90. So the insurance companies are rethinking the whole process. We had a hailstorm about 10 days ago in Austin, Texas, that destroyed the rooftop solar panels. Who's going to pay for that? So now people are waking up to reality of energy transition, that they're being dragged into it without realizing the full picture. And now, if someone is going to buy a new Tesla or any new car, they have to look at the insurance rate before even they make the decision, or the insurance premiums. So that's why, back to COP28, the whole narrative is changing everywhere.
And I think that this is a very important sentence to conclude this conversation. It is also important because now more details are coming to light. Energy transition is not only inflationary against the background of already inflationary post-pandemic environment, and also raging, actually the biggest and obviously the largest war that is now raging on the European continent, with global ramifications, global socioeconomic ramifications linked to the energy and the food commodities. So all of this added together is going to be an eye-opener for a lot of nations, also against the background of the fact that countries like India and China, and you said more than 80% of oil demand is going to countries like this, and obviously the ASEAN region with economic growth projection in this decade. These are countries that do not actually intend to decarbonize by 2050 as Europe, but at least have a window of opportunity for the next 10 to 20 years. So they have already officially announced that they are not going to decarbonize earlier than 2060, 2070. So we have also a big disparity in the political ambitions of the key geopolitical players. And final point, where in my view, there is a lot of misunderstanding, is that energy transition would mean no raw materials, where in fact we are going to witness a huge scale of mining and processing, which are the very same dirty processes as described by a lot of environmentalists, of raw materials. A lot of these raw materials, which are now linked to some of the processes that you described, linked to the electric vehicles, linked to the digitalization, to the energy transition, are the same raw materials that are going to unleash new competition, a new great game between the key players in various parts of the world. Most of this will be affected also by already raging military conflicts or any kind of ethnic, religious conflicts, terrorist activities, and so on and so forth. So to expect that because it's a political decision on energy transition that has nothing to do with actually the access to natural resources, as you also outlined, I think is utterly naive and irresponsible in the long run. So in a sense, I think that there will be a lot of...
Please allow me to just mention one point along your points, that within domestic politics itself, we have a serious problem. and politicians basically are going to really have a serious problem. Look at what Biden did just 2 days ago. We have a labor strike against the main auto manufacturers in the United States who are switching, who got the money from Biden, and they are switching from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. And then we have the strike. The strike basically, it had many grievances, but those workers literally understand that electric vehicles have very few parts, while ICE vehicles has many parts. And there are many factories in the United States that are going to be shut down, completely shut down. And tens of thousands of workers are going to lose their jobs because of the move to electric vehicles. Yet, Biden sent the money to the auto manufacturers to manufacture those cars. At the same time, he picketed with the strikers at the same time because he needs their votes. So all of a sudden, within the Democratic Party itself, we have this contradiction between supporting the labor movement on one side and the energy transition on the other. So it's not only international among various companies and various players, even on domestic levels, we see that conflict.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this is what we are going to observe in this and in the next years. So, Dr. Alhajji, thank you very much for being my guest. Thank you also for your valuable contributions on daily and weekly basis. Make sure
Thank you.
to check out Dr. Alhajji on Twitter. He's very active. He's posting a lot of information. He's making a lot of information, and actually his analysis is also available to a broader audience. But also consider to check out his webpage and to also subscribe on Substack to his daily or weekly analysis. Dr. Alhajji, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.